Hey, so today I'm going to be doing a review on House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. So to put this book into layman's terms, and the most accurate way I can describe it is that it's the book equivalent to a found footage horror film. At least that's the only way I can wrap my mind around it, and the only way I can describe it to people who haven't actually read it yet. So the story starts out with Johnny Truant, who's a young man looking for a new apartment, and one of his friends suggests the building that he actually lives in, as an old man named Zampano has recently passed away and there's a vacancy. So Johnny goes to investigate this apartment, and within the apartment he discovers an academic journal written on a documentary film titled The Navidson Record. And with this discovery we find out what happens to the Navidson family after they moved into their new home in Virginia. The house seems to be perfect and they're ready to settle down into their suburban life and start raising their family, up until one day when a door to a darkened hallway appears in their home and Will Navidson becomes absolutely consumed with unravelling the mystery around it. Right, so I'm actually going to put the book down now because it's getting a little bit heavy. So Will Navidson is a famous photographer in the story, and he uses his skills in photography to dip into documentary filmmaking to document these changes that are happening in his house, so he actually has proof. He ends up getting a team of people over to his house, including his brother Tom, to investigate the hallway and to go through it and try to find out where it came from, to find out where it's going. By doing this, they find out that the hallway actually leads to multiple rooms and is ever expanding and contracting based on where they're going. The story jumps back and forth between Johnny and the Navidson family, and to be perfectly honest, myself and Johnny did not get on very well because of this. I was getting so wrapped up in what was happening in the house and what was happening in the hallway and the expedition in that when it would suddenly jump back to Johnny and his mundane life, I would be infuriated. Because at some points it is very infuriating because it will even cut through halfway through a sentence. But after around the 200-page mark, I was able to lighten up a bit and give Johnny more of a chance, because after all, he is the one relaying the information to us. And this leads me into discussing the writing style and formatting of House of Leaves. So if you've flipped through this, you'll know that it's all over the place and that there's a lot of different writing styles to it. There are certain pages that have wall-to-wall font, and then there are other pages that only have one or two words on them. And this is a technique to try and create a greater sense of immersion for the reader and to reflect what's taking place to the characters at any given point, but primarily what's happening in the hallway. And what's interesting is that the writing does draw you in, but the formatting of it tries to push you away. One of the things that I was nervous about when taking this book on was that I wasn't going to have an accurate visual of the house or what was happening in the house. But due to the amount of description, the vast amount of description of what's happening in this house, I didn't really have any issue there. And some of the description is so vivid that I felt like when it was describing what was taking place in the hallway and how the hallway looked and the stale air that was in this hallway, I felt like I could taste the air in my mouth, like the graininess to it, the staleness to it. I felt like it was the equivalent to standing in a coal shed. And there was multiple parts of this book that were so vividly described that I ended up having such a visceral reaction to, and I've never really experienced anything like that before while reading. So to go back to the pages that have very few words on them, the words that are on these pages are actually formatted as a visual to describe what the words actually mean. So for example, if the word is stretched, the word will actually be stretched across the page. And I have to be honest, this is one of my favorite segments of the book, because not only are you absolutely flying through it, and as a reader you're thinking, this is great, I've just knocked out 30 pages in 5 minutes. But by doing this, it really does create a sense of space as to what's happening in the hallway, in the rooms where Navidson is exploring and what's happening to him. Ultimately, you're hit with this massive wall of font, which is Johnny's segment coming back in, and it really does make the reader feel like they're like Navidson having hit a dead end or being walled in, or that the walls are caving in on you. By doing this, Danielewski took quite a big risk with the formatting, as it can be something that's a bit off-putting or even viewed as something that's quite gimmicky. However, I felt like it was actually going above and beyond to create that sense of immersion for the reader. And even though the formatting might be something that you're completely not used to, you do tend to get used to it after the 100-page mark, and you do really get into the fact that you have to rotate the book around or use a mirror to read certain parts of the text. There are also a ton of references within this book. Some that I got, some that I didn't get, and then some that I was actually kind of annoyed that I didn't get while I was researching afterwards. A lot of the footnotes contain real citations that you can go and look up after you read it or while you're reading it in order to understand the reference to what's happening in the story. And speaking of research, the amount of research that must have been done in order to create the story in the first place is absolutely astonishing. It definitely is 5 stars just for effort alone. Like, I've never read anything quite like it before. All of this just really helped pulling the story together for me, and even down to referencing the photos on the spine, because if you notice, they're all different houses, and I always wondered about that before picking it up, being like, I wonder why they're all different. Like, is there multiple houses, or is there something else going on? And no, it's referenced by Johnny, and I just thought that was great. It just felt like everything was being wrapped up quite nicely. So if I would have to put this novel into a genre, I would have to say that it was probably modern gothic psychological horror. There was actually only one element of gore horror or sort of bizarro horror, and it was really, really intense. A lot of the horror in this is actually conveyed and internalized through the characters themselves, the two obvious ones being Karen, Will's partner, who is dreadfully claustrophobic, who knows for a fact that if anything was to go wrong within the hallway with Will, she would not be able to go in there after him. And she's absolutely petrified of this hallway and what it actually represents. And then the other one, which may not be super obvious at first, is that their eldest son, Chad, opts to spend most of his time outside of the house. And at first this can be looked at as just a child throwing a strop, being upset that they've been uprooted and have to start their life over again and make new friends. But as we get deeper into the novel, we realise that maybe Chad's actually picking up on the atmosphere in the house and that there's something that really unsettles him about it. Another thing is that this book actually relies quite heavily on the reader's own personal fear, and that comes into play as there is something for everyone in this, as I feel like it hits most of the horror genres. What creeped me out the most was the idea that was presented very, very briefly, so briefly that I thought it would actually be referenced again later on in the novel, but ultimately it wasn't, was that the house may be specifically targeting people in a really insidious way. So Will Davidson may have potentially been targeted by the house because of his fractured mentality, due to the fact that he has seen a lot of trauma in his life due to his job. And though he may seem like a well put together person, there's a lot of stuff that he's trying to contend with underneath the surface. And the fact that maybe the house picked up on this, and that's why he ended up getting so invested in trying to figure out what was happening in the house. And that's a theory that makes a lot of sense to me personally. But at the end of the day, what this book really does is try to make you make sense of something that's nonsensical. And it really is just a commentary on how humankind always try to figure out what's in front of them. Even though there are things that happen in this world that are completely unexplainable, we still try to explain it. Because for whatever reason, our brains just can't process the idea that maybe there is no reason for it. What adds an extra layer of fear for the reader is the vast amount of possibilities as to what's actually happening within the story. We are presented with a plethora of information in order to sort through, and at times this can feel quite overwhelming. But we are the ones who are forced to determine what's true and what's not, and at a certain point the footnotes really come into play, because you've got the editors, Zampano and Johnny, all fighting it out in the footnotes, and you're trying to figure out who's actually telling the correct version of the story. However, I did feel like all this information was a little bit detrimental to the ending, just because you have so much to sort through, and that I did feel so overwhelmed with it. I would have personally liked to have been steered in a bit of a clearer direction. If you go into this expecting a straight up horror novel, I think you'll be really disappointed. Danielewski definitely makes you work for it, as it's a very layered, nuanced read. I feel like it's important to note that this was actually my 4th time trying to attempt to read House of Leaves. I had 3 previous failed attempts, and miraculously, for whatever reason, I was able to stick with it this time around. Just after I got past the initial 100 pages, I was able to kind of get more into the rhythm of it. And now I just want to talk about some tips that may help you reading it. My first tip is that you need to read House of Leaves as your only book. Don't have any other books on the side, because they will just be distractions, and they will just be far too tempting to pick up rather than reading House of Leaves. This is something that I suffered through the first couple of times trying to read it, as I really felt like I would have benefited from having a fun, light read to pick up as a palate cleanser after my hour or so of reading House of Leaves every day. But ultimately you do kind of have to force yourself through the first 100, 200 pages or so, and it really does feel like work, but it is definitely worthwhile. My next tip is that you need to read it in the order that it's presented in. At first I thought you could read it as if it was a choose your own adventure novel. I thought I could read through the Davidson record and then jump back and read Johnny's story afterwards, but it may seem like you can do that at first, but ultimately the two stories start really tying in together and you really can't do that. And when I was actually researching on whether you could read it like that, I ended up giving myself a massive spoiler. So yeah, read it as it's presented, and for the love of God, don't Google anything about it. My next tip is pretend that you're reading it for college or that you're reading it to study it. You really need to put on your critical thinking study cap when it comes to it, because you're presented, like I said, with so much information. You really do need to focus on what you're reading. And I actually got quite lucky with this time around reading it, because I was reading a lot of academic journals for college at the time, so I was just completely in the zone. Another tip is to try to enjoy it for what it is and try to see it as a journey rather than as something to be conquered. One of the reasons why I think people are so off-put by this book, or maybe fail with this book, is that a lot of us tend to put a timer on what we read. So if you try to read this book in a week, you probably will fail. Don't put a limit on yourself, because the book will kind of tell you how it should be read. At certain points, it's meant to be read quite slowly. At other points, it's meant to be read very fast. And you will naturally pick up on when you should be reading quickly and when you should be reading slowly, and you'll do it without even realizing it. So just go with the flow of the book. Don't try to get it read in a certain amount of days. Just go at your own pace. And my final tip is to actually read the footnotes. Now, at first, when you start reading House of Leaves, they do seem like you don't really need to read them, or you can just skim over them, but at a certain point they really do come into play, so it is very important that you read them, otherwise you're going to be missing out on a whole section of the story. You've got Zampano who's pointing out some of the inconsistencies in the journal and in the documentary, and then you also have Johnny who's just trying to figure out the story for himself. So it is massively important that you do read the footnotes and not skim over it. So that has been my review on House of Leaves. It was really kind of tricky to review, and I know a lot of people kind of struggle with actually talking about this because it is so easy to start giving away spoilers, and that's why I purposely left out any sort of character analysis, because I figured that that would just be giving away too much. And it's nice going into this not really knowing what to expect, and then you come out of it probably with a completely different version of events as to what someone else who's also read it. So let me know what you thought of it down in the comments. Let me know if you're planning to read it. Hopefully my tips help you get through it this time if you're someone who struggled reading it before. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.